So what can you tell me about Shanann and Chris and their relationship?
He was a great father.
Okay.
I mean, I couldn't ask for a better father for him, for the kids. I mean, honestly, did everything for them. Played with them, bathed them. I couldn't ask for someone better.
Okay.
Husband-wise, same way. Never seen any kind of problems with him. I was out here prior to the 6 weeks she was here. I don't know the exact date before they both went on the vacation with her Thrive company.
Mm-hmm.
And watched the kids. There was a little bit of difference in him, but I just took it as being a father. I mean, he was getting a little sterner with the girls. I mean, it was nothing, he was always the quiet type with them.
Mm-hmm.
But he started getting a little sterner with them, and I just took it as being a father. Now he's getting a little bit tired of what they're doing, running them all over, so he's just getting stern with them. Never hit him that I know of. It's hard. There's different things that was going on. I mean, he did change his. They were going through this new Thrive stuff, or she was selling, and he started getting himself all built up and lost a lot of weight. But he was always a body type person. Always took care of his body and all that. So they did come out. Janet came out for 6 weeks with the girls. They were going back and forth from our house to his house, his mother's house.
Okay.
And the little Celeste had allergies to nuts,
mm-hmm.
tree nuts. Very allergic to them. She had 2 EpiPens she had to carry with her. So she told us all, get rid of anything that's got nuts or any, just get it up high enough. Don't gotta throw it away, just get it out, no problem. My wife cleaned the whole house out. I mean, I had to go looking for stuff.
Mm-hmm.
She took underneath every cabinet. So she told Chris's parents the same thing. They did go over her house a couple times, and Chris's mom really never got along with Shanann because she took her son away from him. That's how we took it. They didn't come to her wedding, their engagement party. They didn't come to nothing to theirs. So when Shanann was over, I think it was the second week she was there, the weekend, she had called me up frantically and said, "Get me the hell out of here now." The mother had nuts all over the place, and they're all worn. And she was there a week prior and told her to make sure this is this way. So the mother, at that time, Shanann was feeding the girls some hot dogs for lunch and all this, and she had her other 2 nieces and nephews over. And they came out with ice cream with all these nuts in it. And so ended up being, Shanann and her had little words. And Shanann said no. And she called me up and said, "I got to go. We just had a blowout because, she's got nuts on the table, nuts on the in the cabinet right there open for this little girl." And she said, "No, I'm done." And so she told Shanann, "Well, that's just a training lesson or something like that to her, I'm like, it's a 3-year-old girl you're talking to. It's not something you're trying to, discipline. Birthday present, hey, your sister's getting a birthday present today. You're not getting one because it's not your birthday. That's some kind of, saying this is what you do,
Right.
So Shanann called Chris and told Chris about it. So Chris said he called his parents that night. And his mother told him the same thing. That's what we heard. I didn't hear it, but that's what Shanann had said. So, of course, Shanann never went back to the house with the children. She stayed at our house. So, there was a few times that Shanann would FaceTime Chris because she would FaceTime every night because of the children. Mm-hmm. And there was a few times, a couple of times it did catch me off guard, like, what's going on? Because she was like, "Are you going to pay attention to the children?" Like he was in another world out there. And he's like, yeah. And like I said, And I started saying, well, what's he doing? Is he just not, ignoring him and just not paying attention, watching TV or whatever, Um, when he came out, he was the same way. If you've ever seen Anthony, if you've seen Chris, he's just the same way. That's how he is. There's no, everything you see in the courtrooms or whatever, he's the same way. That's just how he was.
As far as
His demeanor, he was just more straightforward and didn't,
quiet.
yeah, he wasn't the really, he would talk to us when we were there, everything he'd have a good time, but it just doesn't.
He was a great father. I couldn't think of a better father. That's what Frank Rzucek said. And I've heard those words before. Not once, not twice, but too many times in 30 years of studying the men who slaughter the people they swore to protect. It always starts the same way. A man who seems quiet, kind, involved. Family photos full of laughter. Birthday parties. Matching outfits. Social media smiles. The kind of man you'd trust with your daughter. The kind of man you'd leave your grandchildren with. The kind of man you'd invite to dinner, not knowing you just shook hands with the end. Frank believed in Chris Watts. He wasn't naive. He wasn't blind. He was a father trying to understand how the floor beneath him had collapsed without warning. When Shanann and the girls disappeared, he defended the man he knew, the one who showed up to every barbecue, who played with the kids on the lawn, who looked him in the eyes and called him dad. But that man never existed. Chris Watts wasn't the perfect father. He was the perfect mask. And when it slipped, it didn't just destroy one family. It shattered the image of what love, fatherhood, and normalcy are supposed to look like. That's the real horror in these cases. It's not just the act. It's the contradiction. The unbearable gap between who we thought they were and what they did when no one was watching. Chris played the long game. He smiled in photos, whispered goodnight to his girls, and texted "I love you" like clockwork. But behind that silence was a plan. Not an explosion, but a calculation. One that ended in oil tanks and a shallow grave. Frank's words weren't foolish. They were human. A father trying to speak light into darkness. Trying to convince the world, and maybe himself, that there was still a chance this wasn't what it looked like. That the man who tucked in his granddaughters couldn't possibly be the same one who took their last breath away. But I've seen it. Over and over again. Fathers, husbands, lovers. They wear the mask so well. Even the people who love them the most can't tell it's slipping. Chris Watts didn't just murder his family. He murdered the story everyone else believed. And it began with a lie so convincing, it left even a grieving father holding on to a fantasy. I couldn't think of a better father. Those words are the cruelest kind of echo. Because now, they don't speak of who Chris was. They speak of what he pretended to be. And that is how monsters move through this world. Quietly, carefully, dressed as fathers. When a father loses his daughter, the mind does something strange. It rewinds. It replays every conversation, every weekend visit, every holiday dinner. And in that looping silence, it tries to find the moment when everything changed. The second the mask cracked, the eyes shifted, the words stopped meaning what they used to mean. But Frank Rzucek never saw it. He saw a man who fixed things around the house. A man who got down on the floor with Bella and Cece and played like a kid. A man who didn't yell, didn't drink, didn't raise his hand. Chris Watts didn't look like the storm. He looked like peace. Quiet. Predictable. But the thing about peace is, sometimes, it's just the silence before the scream. Frank's words weren't just a memory. They were an alibi for a version of Chris that never really existed. He wasn't lying to the police. He was trying to protect the last piece of his world that still made sense. And that's what makes this story so devastating. In 30 years of studying men who kill their families, there is one constant that echoes through the ruins. Everyone trusted them. The wives trusted them with their futures. The children trusted them with their safety. The parents trusted them with their daughters. And when it all unravels, the survivors are left asking the same question: what did I miss? But this isn't about blame. It's about design. Men like Chris are built to deceive. They don't erupt, they erode. Slowly, secretly, smiling all the while. They play the long game, the patient game. They don't raise suspicion, they lower it. They make you feel safe just long enough to forget what danger looks like. Frank Rzucek didn't miss the warning signs. Chris never gave him any. Not the real kind. Not the kind you can hold up to the light and say, this is where it started. Because it didn't start with violence. It started with detachment, with distance, with small lies and hollow eyes and smiles that didn't reach his soul. But from the outside, it looked like a man who loved his family. And that's why Frank's words carry so much weight. Because they weren't just a misjudgment. They were a mirror, reflecting what the world saw, what the family believed, what Shanann might have hoped was still true. He was a great father. That sentence wasn't just a statement. It was a prayer. A desperate hope that what happened wasn't what it looked like. That maybe, just maybe, the man who gave his daughter grandchildren wasn't the same man who buried them. But he was. And Frank had to live with the knowledge that the man he welcomed into his home, into his heart, was the same man who tore everything apart. That kind of betrayal doesn't just break you. It rewrites you. You start to question your instincts, your memories, your judgment. You wonder if you ever really knew the people around you. If love made you blind. If trust made you weak. But Frank wasn't weak. He was a father doing what fathers do, believing in the good he thought he saw. And that is what men like Chris exploit. Not hatred, not vengeance, but belief. They weaponize the love people have for them. And when the mask finally falls, they don't just destroy lives. They destroy the very meaning of truth. I couldn't think of a better father. Frank said that because in his world, at that moment, the alternative was unthinkable. But in my world, the world of bloodstains, autopsy reports, and broken family photos, I've learned that the unthinkable is often just one secret away that he didn't shout. He didn't slam doors. He didn't throw things. He didn't storm out of the house. Chris Watts wasn't the kind of man people feared. He was the kind they forgot. Quiet, passive, always agreeable. The man who avoided conflict by disappearing into himself. The kind of man who blends into barbecues and bedtime routines without ever revealing what's underneath. And that's exactly why no one saw him coming. Because killers like Chris don't walk into the room with red flags. They walk in with diaper bags and juice boxes. They kiss their daughters on the forehead. They do the dishes. They post pictures on Facebook with captions like, "My beautiful family." And they do it all with a smile that doesn't even tremble. Chris Watts didn't create chaos. He created calm. And behind that calm, he built the perfect illusion. The illusion of the devoted father, the loving husband, the steady provider. Every move was calculated to keep people from looking too closely. But underneath that stillness was someone else entirely. In my years of studying men like him, I've learned that the most dangerous personalities are not the loud ones. They're the empty ones. The ones who don't react, who don't cry, who don't connect. The ones who walk through life wearing a human mask they've memorized from other people. Chris studied what fatherhood was supposed to look like, and he mimicked it. He mimicked love. He mimicked involvement. But it was never about connection. It was about control. It was about keeping the image alive long enough to get what he wanted. And the people around him, they believed it. How could they not? He coached his daughter's sports teams. He changed diapers. He stood beside Shanann in family photos with his arms around her waist. He wasn't absent. He was present. And that presence was the performance. But here's the truth no one wants to hear. You can't always spot the killer. Because sometimes, the killer's the one handing out birthday cake. Chris wasn't sloppy. He was meticulous. His silence was his shield. His dullness, his disguise. He didn't draw attention to himself. He faded into the background. And from there, he watched. He waited. He wore his mask so long, even he began to believe it. And that's the tragedy. Because the people who loved him weren't fools. They were witnesses to a lie they didn't know was being told. Shanann believed she was building a life with a husband who loved her. Frank believed he had gained a son who adored his grandchildren. The world believed that what they saw on social media, the vacations, the kisses, the laughs, was real. But it wasn't. It was a stage. And Chris played his role to perfection. Until one day, he didn't want the role anymore. And instead of walking away, he erased the people who gave him the part. That's the part no one ever sees coming. Because we don't expect fathers to become predators. We don't expect husbands to destroy what they helped create. And when they do, we search for answers in the rubble, forgetting that the performance was the weapon all along. Chris Watts didn't snap. He transitioned from actor to executioner. And that transition was so smooth, so quiet, that no one, not even the people who loved him most, realized they were watching the final act. Deception is not an accident. It's an art form. And the men who master it rarely look like villains. They look like Chris Watts. Soft-spoken, even-tempered, dependable. The kind of man who doesn't raise his voice, doesn't start fights, doesn't cheat, until he does. The kind of man who disappears into routines, who blends into suburbia, who says all the right things while feeling nothing at all. These men don't lie the way the rest of us do. They lie with their lives. Their smile is a lie. Their silence is a lie. Their kindness is a lie. And the tragedy is that the people around them don't see a liar. They see a man who's easy to be around. Non-threatening. Low drama. Safe. But safety, in the hands of a sociopath, is a disguise. Chris Watts didn't manipulate with charm. He manipulated with quiet. He didn't seduce his wife with grand gestures. He seduced her with consistency. He didn't raise suspicions because he never raised alarms. He simply existed, emotionally vacant, morally hollow, but physically present. And that's how he got away with it, until he didn't. In the psychological profile of family annihilators, there are patterns. Men like Chris often suffer from a deep, internal emptiness. Not the kind that comes from trauma, but the kind that's structural. Built in. They feel pressure, but not connection. They feel stress, but not empathy. They know what love looks like, but they don't know what it feels like. So they study it. They mimic it. They practice it like a script. And for a while, it works. They get married. They have children. They take the photos. They go through the motions. But eventually, the mask begins to strain. The demands of real emotional intimacy become too heavy. And when their carefully controlled world begins to wobble, an affair, a financial problem, a relationship shift, they panic. But their panic doesn't look like tears. It looks like calculation. To a man like Chris, murder wasn't an outburst. It was a solution, a way to reclaim control, a way to wipe the board clean and start over, without confrontation, without scandal, without having to explain himself. Because that's the core of this kind of personality. They don't feel remorse. They feel inconvenience. Chris didn't kill because he was enraged. He killed because he was cornered by his own choices. And rather than face the collapse of his false image, he chose to remove the people who knew him best. In my experience, sociopathic family killers often aren't driven by hatred. They're driven by detachment, cold logic. They see the people in their lives as roles, not souls. Wife, daughter, parent. And when those roles begin to interfere with the story they want to tell, they erase them. That's the terror of deception at this level. It's not chaotic. It's orderly. It's rehearsed. It's polite. And that's why families like the Rzuceks never see it until it's too late. Because they weren't loving a monster. They were loving a mask. And masks don't bleed when they fall. Shanann Watts believed in second chances. She believed in rebuilding, in pushing through, in holding on even when everything in you wants to let go. And maybe that's why she stayed. Not because she didn't see the cracks, but because she hoped the cracks could be filled. She was strong, outspoken, loyal. She loved loudly. She forgave deeply. And when Chris began to pull away, she didn't react with rage. She responded with hope, with effort, with long text messages and handwritten love notes and late-night calls begging for honesty. But honesty never came. only more silence. And in that silence, she filled in the gaps with hope. In her final weeks, Shanann started to feel it. That growing distance, that familiar dread. The way his eyes no longer held her gaze. The way he answered questions with clipped words or fake smiles. She felt it in her bones. A woman always knows. But knowing and accepting are two different things. She was 5 months pregnant. She had 2 daughters. A mortgage. A name built on strength. And she had fought too hard to build this family to let it crumble without a fight. So she held on. She kept posting the family photos. She kept saying, "I love you" in her videos. She kept the image alive, not because it was fake, but because she believed if she kept loving hard enough, loud enough, deep enough, the man she married might return. But he was already gone. Chris had checked out, not just emotionally, spiritually. He had rewritten the story in his head and was now living in a version of reality where Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were obstacles, not family. And still, she didn't stop loving him. That's the part that breaks me. She died loving the man who had already decided to end her life. She went to bed next to her killer. She brought his unborn son into the world, believing they were still building a future. But the future was already being planned without her. There are messages Shanann sent that read like whispers from a woman clinging to the edge of something she can't name. Pleas for affection. Apologies for being too much. Questions that were never answered. And above all, silence. From the man who once couldn't wait to be home. It's a silence I've seen before. In the final stages of emotional betrayal, the victim always becomes quieter, more careful, less certain, and the predator becomes colder, more rehearsed, less human. Shanann didn't miss the signs. She just hoped they weren't signs at all. She hoped they were temporary, that the man she once knew was buried under stress or confusion or work. She hoped that if she just said the right thing, did the right thing, loved the right way, he would come back. But men like Chris don't come back, because they were never truly there. She wasn't blind. She was brave. Brave enough to try. Brave enough to love through distance. Brave enough to forgive in advance, not knowing the price. And when the end came, she didn't run. She walked into her home, trusting that the man who fathered her children would never be her enemy. But he was. And she died with that trust still intact. Some might call that naivety. I call it the cruelest kind of love, the kind that believes, even as it's being erased. North Carolina was supposed to be a break, a breath of fresh air, a summer away from the noise. Shanann packed up the girls and drove across the country to spend 6 weeks with her family. Laughter, sunshine, her father's hugs, her mother's cooking. It was supposed to be normal. It was supposed to be home. But something followed her there. Or rather, something didn't. Chris. He stayed behind for 5 of those 6 weeks. Claimed it was work. Claimed he'd catch up. But time stretched long, and his silence grew wider. He barely called. He barely checked in. Shanann was pregnant, tired, lonely, and the man who once couldn't stand to be away from her now treated her absence like a favor. She felt it, and she said it. In message after message, she wrote of her confusion, her sadness, her fear that something was slipping away. She begged for a sign, a touch, a word. Anything that would tell her he still saw her. But all she got was cold space. When Chris finally arrived in North Carolina for that last week, something was different. Not just in his eyes, but in his energy. He was thinner, detached, and something in him felt absent. The girls ran to him. Shanann held him. But he didn't come back the same man. That week was filled with quiet conflict. Tension beneath the surface. Small things that didn't feel small. He was distant with Shanann, calculated with his words, disconnected from the family around him. And then came the event now known as Nutgate. Cindy Watts, Chris's mother, gave ice cream with nuts to Celeste, knowing full well she had a severe allergy. Shanann was livid, furious at the recklessness, furious that Chris didn't defend her, furious that the woman who should have protected her granddaughter had instead created a risk that could have turned deadly. But Chris didn't stand up for his wife. He didn't defend his child. He stood there blank, passive, silent. It was in that moment, standing between the woman who raised him and the woman carrying his unborn son, that Chris chose no one. And maybe Shanann knew, in that moment, that something was broken. The family tried to move on from the fight, tried to bury the anger beneath vacation photos and beach days. But the damage was done. The air was different now. The smiles were forced. And Shanann, strong as ever, tried to keep the pieces from falling apart. Because that's what women do when men disappear emotionally. They become the glue. She made the girls' schedules. She planned the meals. She held the camera while Chris played with the kids, even as her heart quietly questioned why he only showed up when the lens was on. But she kept going. She smiled in photos. She kissed him on the cheek. Because this was her family. And she believed, maybe if she loved harder, louder, better, it would be enough. But what she didn't know was that Chris had already made a decision, and it had nothing to do with Nutgate, or stress, or work, or even her. It had to do with control. North Carolina was supposed to be a retreat, a reset. Instead, it became a rehearsal for the end. Chris returned to Colorado alone. Shanann stayed behind a few more days to gather herself, to rest, to reset. But something followed her back. Not a man, a plan. And the worst part of it all, no one knew. Not her parents, not her friends, not even Shanann herself. Because the people who destroy families don't strike in chaos. They strike when the house is quiet, when the kids are asleep, when no one is looking. And North Carolina, that last summer of sunlight and sweetness, became the final piece before the storm no one saw coming. It was early morning when Shanann came home. August 13th, 2018. She'd just flown back from a business trip in Arizona. Tired, pregnant, barely a few hours of sleep. Her friend dropped her off around 1:48 a.m. The porch camera caught the last known footage of her alive. A pregnant woman walking into her home, unaware that death was already waiting inside. Chris Watts was in the house. Awake, alert, ready. What happened in the hours that followed, we only know because he confessed. And even that came late. At first, he played the grieving husband, the worried father. He gave interviews. He told stories. He asked for prayers. He begged the world to help find his family. But behind the cameras, behind the interviews, behind the crocodile tears, his daughters were already gone. He killed Shanann in their bed. He claimed she never screamed. He claimed she didn't fight. But that's a lie. Every woman fights in some way, even if it's only with her eyes. She was pregnant, asleep, trusting, and he took her last breath in the same room where she once carried his dreams. Then, one by one, he took the girls. Bella, Cece. He drove their lifeless bodies and his still-alive daughter over 40 miles to an oil site where he worked. Bella watched as he buried her mother. She asked him, "Is the same thing going to happen to me as Shanann?" She was 4 years old, and he answered her with silence. That silence, that cold, calculated stillness, is the moment the mask fell. Not to the world, not yet, but to himself. Because in that moment, there was no more pretending, no more good father, no more loving husband, just the man he had always been underneath, empty, hollow, capable of anything. He stuffed their small bodies into crude oil tanks. Shanann buried nearby in a shallow grave. And then, he went back to work. He texted colleagues. He made casual conversation. He called the school to unenroll his daughters. He played the part of the concerned husband, all while the echoes of what he'd done were still floating in the back seat of his truck. But masks never stay on forever. They crack, and Chris's began to crumble within hours. Shanann's friend, Nikki, knew something was wrong. She called. She texted. She showed up at the house. She called the police. And that was the beginning of the end. The officers arrived. They knocked. Chris opened the door with a folded smile and shallow concern. He allowed them in, pointing to her purse, her keys, her phone, everything still there. Everything except her. His lies were thin, and the people around him began to feel it. His voice lacked urgency. His body language was off. His eyes didn't match his words. Within 48 hours, the mask was gone. He failed a polygraph. And under the cold weight of the interrogation room, he broke. He confessed. Not to the full truth, not at first. He blamed Shanann, claimed she killed the kids, and he retaliated. But that, too, was a lie. Because Chris Watts didn't kill in a moment of rage. He killed with preparation, with quiet intent, with time. And when the truth finally came out, the full, sickening truth, the world was stunned. Not just by what he did, but by who he pretended to be. The man who coached his daughter's t-ball team. The man who kissed Shanann on Facebook Live. The man Frank Rzucek once called the best father he'd ever seen. It was all a costume, a performance, a mask so perfectly worn it fooled everyone. Until it didn't. And in that moment of truth, that final unveiling, the horror wasn't just what Chris did. It was that no one saw it coming. Chris Watts was not the first man to smile in family photos and then erase the faces beside him. He was not the first to cradle his daughter in one arm and murder her with the other. Not the first to kiss his wife goodnight and then strangle her before dawn. Not the first to walk into a home full of laughter and leave it in silence. There's a pattern, a terrible, quiet pattern. We call them family annihilators. Men who destroy their entire households in a single calculated act. And they almost never look like killers. They look like fathers. They go to work. They pay bills. They mow the lawn. They show up to church on Sunday. And behind it all, something festers. A lie they can no longer maintain. A secret that's about to collapse. A pressure they believe only murder can relieve. To the outside world, Chris Watts was calm. Normal. Predictable. But behind closed doors, the illusion was fraying. Debt. Infidelity. Emotional distance. A wife who was finally starting to ask questions. A life he no longer wanted, but didn't have the courage to walk away from. So he did what so many like him have done before. He wiped the slate clean. It's not just about killing. It's about control. It's about rewriting the story with one final, irreversible stroke. Scott Peterson, Neil Entwistle, John List. These men wore the same mask. They loved the spotlight of admiration, but crumbled under the weight of responsibility. And when the pressure built, financial ruin, marital collapse, exposed secrets, they didn't seek help. They sought erasure. That's what makes family annihilation so monstrous. The victim is not an enemy, not a stranger, not a rival. The victim is love itself. And these men don't kill out of hate. They kill out of inconvenience. Shanann wasn't holding him back. She was holding the family together. And that made her a mirror. One that reflected the truth about who Chris had become. And like most cowards, he couldn't face it. So he shattered the mirror. And when the girls woke up, he finished the job. People struggle to understand how. How a man can sing nursery rhymes with his daughters and still choose to end them. How a husband can rest his head beside a pregnant wife and still decide to take her last breath. But the answer is simple and horrifying. Love, to a man like Chris Watts, is a script. It's a costume. It's a means to an end. And when the performance is no longer useful, it ends like every lie eventually does, with silence. The pattern always ends the same way. Shock. Confusion. Courtrooms filled with people asking how this could happen. And behind it all, there is always someone like Frank Rzucek, a father left holding the image of a man he thought he knew, crushed by the realization that he had welcomed the devil into his home. And the truth? The devil didn't arrive with fire. He arrived with bedtime stories and gentle hands. He arrived smiling. The trial ended. Chris Watts was sentenced to life without parole. No cameras. No trial by jury. Just a courtroom filled with shattered people and a man who sat motionless. The same stillness he wore while he planned the end of his family. But the sentence he received that day wasn't the only one handed down. There were other victims in that room. Victims who still wake up every morning with the weight of what he did pressing against their chests. Survivors who didn't die, but lost everything that gave their lives meaning. Frank Rzucek lost his daughter, his granddaughters, his unborn grandson, and the version of the world he once believed in. And now, he lives in a kind of silence no one deserves. The kind where holidays become grave visits, where home videos hurt more than they heal, where a man stares at pictures of smiling children, knowing exactly how their story ends. He doesn't sleep the same. He doesn't smile the same. He breathes, but only because he has no choice. That's the sentence of the survivors. They live with the question, why didn't I see it? They replay every conversation, every visit, every text message. They search for the clue that might have changed the outcome. But there is no clue, no single moment, no obvious sign. Because Chris wore the mask so well, even the people who loved him most never saw the monster underneath. And now, Frank is left with more than grief. He's left with guilt. And guilt is cruel. It doesn't care that he did everything right, that he loved his daughter fiercely, that he trusted a man who gave him no reason not to. Guilt whispers lies in the dark. It tells a grieving father that he should have known. It tells a mother that if she had said one more thing, done one more thing, it might have made a difference. But the truth is, the only person who could have stopped it was the man who did it. The survivors are not to blame, but they carry the weight anyway. Because when a man wipes out his entire family, he doesn't just kill the people in his house. He kills the future. He kills the laughter. He kills the dreams unborn. He kills the man Frank used to be. And what's left is something quieter, harder, older. Frank Rzucek stood in that courtroom and spoke words no father should ever have to say. He begged the judge to show mercy, not to Chris, but to the memory of his daughter, to the dignity of his granddaughters, to the legacy of a family destroyed by someone who never deserved to be in it. And when he left that room, the cameras followed him. The world watched him walk away. But what they didn't see was how heavy his steps were. What they didn't hear were the questions still screaming inside his mind. What they'll never feel is what it's like to be the man who once said he was a great father, and now lives every day with the weight of how wrong he was. In the end, Chris Watts didn't escape. He didn't start a new life. He didn't get the fantasy he thought he wanted. He traded his family for a prison cell, a future for a cage. But even behind bars, the damage is still spreading, through a family left behind, through a father who wakes up every morning to silence, through a country still trying to understand how something so monstrous could have looked so normal. And that's the part that lingers. The horror wasn't just in what Chris did. It was in who he pretended to be. Because the truth is, the devil doesn't always arrive with horns and fire. Sometimes he shows up with bedtime stories and a work badge. Sometimes he takes family photos and grills burgers on the 4th of July. Sometimes he kisses your daughter on the forehead and calls you dad. The devil wears a familiar face, and that's what makes him so dangerous. In my 30 years of studying family murder, I've seen this pattern unfold too many times. Men who want out, but not honorably. Men who want freedom, but not the consequences. Men who see the people who love them as obstacles instead of blessings. They smile until the very end. And when they strike, they don't just take lives, they take legacies. They take futures that will never be lived. They take children who will never grow old. They take voices that will never speak again. But most devastating of all, they take trust. Because after a man like Chris Watts, every soft-spoken husband, every smiling father, every quiet neighbor begins to look different. We question what we see. We second-guess what we know. And we wonder, if evil can look like this, how will we ever recognize it again? Frank Rzucek said, "He was a great father. I couldn't think of a better father." And those words will echo forever, not because they were naive, but because they were true to him. And that's what makes this story so human, so tragic. Because love blinded him, trust fooled him, and by the time the mask fell, everything he loved had already been taken. So if there's one lesson I've learned, one truth that cuts through all the lies, it's this. Evil doesn't always knock down the door. Sometimes it holds it open for you. Sometimes it helps you carry groceries. Sometimes it tucks your grandchildren in at night. And sometimes it smiles from across the dinner table. We want to believe we'd know. That if danger lived in our home, we'd feel it. That if evil touched our children, we'd stop it. That if someone we loved wore a mask, we'd see it crack. But the truth is, the worst betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people we eat dinner with, the ones we call family, the ones we trust with our children's bedtime prayers, the ones who smile at us across the room, not because they love us, but because they've learned how to pretend. Chris Watts was not a monster in the shadows. He was a husband, a father, a man who held his family in his arms and then buried them with his hands. He didn't kill out of rage. He killed out of detachment, out of selfishness, out of a deep, empty place that no one saw, because he never let them. And that's what we must remember. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it holds your daughter's hand at the altar and tells you she'll always be safe. Until she isn't. So I ask you, what would you have seen? Would you have noticed the silence behind the smile? Would you have questioned the man who never raised his voice? Could love, or honesty, or intervention have changed this outcome? Or was it always going to end this way? What lessons do we take from this? And more importantly, how do we protect the next family before the mask falls again?